When my son was just a baby, I used to take him every Sunday morning, to the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. I started doing it so that I could get the boy out of the house early on Sundays so my wife could sleep in and have at least an hour or two of quiet time to herself. But as my son grew from a baby being pushed around a carriage to a toddler, just barely being able to walk, to eventually a strong, confident little kid walking on his own, our Sunday trips to the botanical gardens continued. They lasted for years. I think we did until he was 5 or 6 years old. It started out as a habit for my wife's benefit, but became a routine that my son and I enjoyed very much. The benefits to him, as he got older and understood what was going on, it gave him something to look forward to. He loved it. It didn't matter what time of year or what the weather was. They were both inside spaces and outside spaces. So week in, week out, Sundays was our day to go to the botanical gardens. Our visits gave him his first sense of independence. We had a path through the gardens that we always followed. Same path, every single time, every time. It was part of the routine. It gave him a sense of comfort. He knew what was coming up next. And because we repeated the same path over and over, he memorized it. And when things changed, he noticed. He was always looking to see if something had changed. And at a place like that, at Botanical Gardens, every season something is different. And of course, within each season, you could watch the plants growing. At a few spots in the garden, there were turtles, snapping turtles in one spot, painted turtles in another. And because we went early every Sunday, very early, we were generally among just very few people that were there at that time. I kind of took advantage of that. Things we would not have done when it was crowded, we had no problem doing when there's basically no one else around. For instance, once we saw a volunteer feeding the painted turtles. After that, I knew where they hid the turtle food. So if no one was around, we would give just a little extra sprinkle of food to get the turtles to come over to us. Our botanical garden visits were so much fun for both me and my son. We started doing it for a good reason, quiet time for my wife. But we kept doing it because it became our thing. Over time, eventually, my son grew bored of the botanical gardens, but our Sunday trips lasted for years. We visited a place called the Fernbank Museum when he was a little older. Then we made the Atlanta Zoo our Sunday trip. Later they opened up the Atlanta Aquarium. That was a great place to visit. And when he was in his early teens, it was Six Flags, the amusement park. For every one of those places, we always bought a family annual pass. And based on how many times we visited over the course of a year, for most of those passes, the cost per visit was like $5 or less. It was money well spent. There's so many positive aspects that came out of our Sunday adventures. I'll mention some of those benefits, but I want to mainly focus on the value of starting good habits that slowly become routines, and some of them eventually become traditions. Now, I'm not talking about habits like brushing your teeth every day or washing your hands before eating. I'm talking about activities that become a big part of your son or daughter's childhood. One of the easiest ways to prepare your kids for life as an adult is by helping them form good activity habits. Now, there are a few very important things you need to think about when you're talking about forming habits. Like, it's arguably easier to form a bad habit than it is to form a good one. There's actually some science to support that. You should look it up sometime. Now, let me stop for a second and define a habit. Textbook definition is, and compare the definition of a habit to an addiction. A habit is a behavior that you repeat regularly. An addiction is a compulsive behavior that you have little to no control over. A bad habit can develop into an addiction. Probably the easiest one to talk about is, giving a baby or a toddler an electronic device to play with. I understand why you do it. You're busy. You don't want to be disrupted, so you hand them that electronic toy, and voila, temporary peace and quiet. And then next time you need some quiet time, where's that device? And the next time, and the next time. It doesn't take long before your little one is whining or screaming to be given that device. It's actually called a habit loop. Cue, routine, reward. It has a very powerful effect on behavior, especially when it involves the release of dopamine in the brain. Pleasurable. Please watch my video titled Manage the Screen Time Nightmare. I offer some practical and powerful things you can do to avoid letting screen time become an addiction. Now, habits can be as good for your kids as they can be bad. So parents, you have to be vigilant. Parents have to pay attention to those repeated behaviors that can lead to not just negative behaviors, but horrible unintended consequences for your kids. I could go on and on about the issues that arise from forming bad habits, but that's not really what I want to focus on when I talk about my ICD parenting approach. I try and spend my time explaining the good things parents can do to develop their children. So, the last thing I'll say about bad habits is that you should really think about your own bad habits. How did they form? When? Why? Do you want your kids to suffer from the bad habits that would diminish their lives rather than the good habits that would put them on a path to success and happiness? So pay attention. Don't lead them down a bad path. Lead them to a life of health, happiness, and fulfillment. Now, good stuff. I'm going to share some of the things my wife and I did to help our son form good activity habits. We started when he was very young, but habits can be formed at any age. I'm still working on forming some good habits of my own, even at my age. Like trying to eat better and exercise several times a week. Stuff virtually all of us can relate to. But if you start with your kids when they're young, very young, it's much easier to get them in the habit of doing something that's good for them. Now, here's a confusing aspect of this stuff. Habits versus a routine. I could give you a technical definition of how habits are different from routines. But for all intents and purposes, they're so closely related that you should kind of think of them as identical twins. Not exactly alike, but pretty darn close. Now, you may think I've gotten off track here, going from talking about my Sunday adventures with my son, and then throwing stuff in about habits, but they're related. You see, you start with simple, positive, developmental behaviors that slowly become a habit. Now, if you work at it and you're consistent, many of those habits become routines. Our Sunday adventures became a routine. It was a combination of all kinds of little habits put together. Getting up early, eating a good breakfast. When we drove there, where we parked. Our path through the garden. Each of those little habits strung together formed our routine for our Sunday adventures. Now, here's the thing about routines. There's comfort in routines. Even when the COVID pandemic was in full bloom, we tended to maintain certain routines that gave a sense of normalcy to us in a world that was anything but normal at that time. And then finally, if you're lucky, some of those routines will evolve into traditions. And there are so many benefits of healthy family traditions. Now, let me get back to my son and I and our Sunday adventures. Our bonding, parent and child, the fun of doing those adventures, part of it being very standardized, like the way we would follow a consistent path through the places we visit. When we had our annual passes to Six Flags, the theme park in Atlanta, we worked out a system, a path, where we could ride almost every roller coaster, almost every one in the park, without ever having a long line to wait in, and most often no line at all. We always got there at opening. We hit every coaster within 90 minutes of getting to the park, and the Six Flags in Atlanta, it had a small water park in the back of the park, which we almost always visited last. So we get wet and have tons of fun before wrapping up our visit. We had a set routine unique to each park, each museum, whatever it was we were visiting. That was the set part. But there was also the non-standard part of our visits, the things that change. I don't think most people realize this, but if you get a very different ride on a roller coaster depending on where you sit. My son and I never realized this until our, 8th, 9th, 10th visit to Six Flags. Sitting in the first car versus the middle car versus the last car, it totally changes the experience drastically. Sometimes we would purposely let people behind us in line go ahead so we could wait for the next roller to show up so we would have fun, so we could get in last in the first car, so we could switch it up. These kinds of habits, these family habits that oftentimes will become routines. Sometimes they were just me and my son. Sometimes just my son and my wife. And of course, other times it was all three of us. These were some of the best family times we ever had. Kids, especially very young kids, they want time with mom and dad. It doesn't need to be all that special. It doesn't need to be a special place. It could be a weekly or monthly board game night. Maybe a movie night. Not going to the movies, a home movie night. Make it a little special. Popcorn, or maybe some specific snack or meal that ties into the movie, or just as special because you only have it on movie nights. These things are something for you to look forward to. And when your kids are young, these special times together create great memories and traditions that, can last a lifetime. Growing up in New Jersey, and I knew some Italian families that had spaghetti dinner nights. Everybody was there. Even when the kids were gone out of the house, they would come back home for spaghetti dinner night. Traditions are all about consistency, a positive repetitiveness, and they bring so much joy and confidence and comfort when you do those things with your family. You start small with habits. You link together some of those habits to form routines. And some of those routines will hopefully become traditions that may even last beyond your family and be continued by your son or daughter when they have families of their own. There's mom time, there's dad time, there's family time. Those are special times that become real to your kids. Small things that very well could grow into big things that matter, that provide comfort and solace in the tough times. There's so many possibilities when starting activity habits with your kids. And I'm not talking about some fancy once-a-year vacation. The activity habits I'm talking about are weekly or monthly. They have to happen often enough to have real meaning as a normal part of their life. Our child's life on a frequent and recurring basis. The habit type activities you start doing with your kids can lead to so many great memories. They can strengthen your relationship with your kids, provide a powerful shared activity. And that's really the key. The activity might be able to be done alone, but because you're doing it together, that's what makes all the difference. When I talk about raising an independent, confident, good decision maker, I'm talking about building a person who finds strength and comfort and positivity in their childhood. A person that will eventually look back on their childhood and recognize and appreciate the things their parents did to help them form good habits. To understand that many of those habits were the building blocks of the routines, and they became routines that helped them grow and to develop into the adult they become, the adult you hope they will eventually become. You can do that. You can. Thanks for listening.